Welcome everybody to our second annual ACJV All Hands webinar. Our last webinar, we did this exactly 1 year ago today on January 31st, 2024, and wanted to continue doing that because we thought that was a success and was really fun to hear from all of you partners on the call. Before we jump into the call, I think we've gone through all this. I won't go through this again. Just I think everyone knows how to use the Teams call features, but just make sure the most important thing is make sure that you are keeping your microphone on mute during the course of the call. And we are asking everyone to please hold their questions until the end, but then we'll have time for question and answer. And of course, chat anytime. What we're going to cover today is a brief overview of the ACJV for those who are less familiar with us. And then we're going to jump into the last year's accomplishments for 2024. And we're going to focus these accomplishments primarily on those things that the JV staff themselves have been directly involved in. We do view the work of the joint venture partnership as the work of all the partners doing all the work, and there's a lot more happening beyond just what the JV staff are involved in. But in the interest of time, we're focusing today's call on just those things that JV staff are involved in. And then we're going to be moving into the plans that we have for 2025, some things that we've already started, things that we've got on in the hopper that we're going to be working on very soon. So for those who are less familiar with who the joint venture is, we are a bird conservation partnership that spans the Atlantic coast from Maine down to Puerto Rico. We're everything here in green. And our focus, because we are such a big joint venture and we occupy 17 different states and the territory of Puerto Rico and have this huge geographical variation in the bird conservation habitats and challenges, our joint venture decided about 9 years ago to adopt a strategic focus on coastal marsh habitats. And we do that work through the lens of salt marsh sparrows, American black ducks, and black rails. And for those who are not familiar with joint ventures as a whole, we are one of 23 joint ventures across the country. So there's pretty much wall-to-wall coverage of joint ventures across North America. Every joint venture can do things differently. They choose what is most important in their joint venture. And our joint venture has chosen this coastal marsh flagship focus. So I'm going to introduce the staff in a little bit and talk about the structure of the joint venture. But before we jump into that, I wanted to hand it over to our board chair, Brad Howard from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, to give some introductory comments.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. As Amy said, I'm Brad Howard. I'm the current chair of the ACJV and the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, Chief of Wildlife Management. So Amy mentioned that I think it was in 2016, the management board selected the coastal focus for our joint venture work in the flagship species, and the partnerships, including many of you, I suspect, developed conservation plans and population objectives and planning tools to help guide the implementation of those focal species plans. So 2016 doesn't seem like that long ago, but it's now 2025, and that was 9 years ago. And so here we are with 3 excellent plans, and the JV staff have turned to implementation of the objectives of the plans in partnership with, well, again, likely all of you on this call, and then some of folks that aren't here. So I think, as you'll see from the presentations today, the staff and the partners of the ACJV have been quite busy this year. The work you'll be hearing about today illustrates some of the many ways the JV is working with partners to advance coastal marsh bird conservation across our Atlantic coast shoreline. So I hope everyone enjoys the presentations, is as impressed as I am with the JV staff, and of course all the partnerships we share along the entire eastern seaboard. So with that, I will turn it back over to Amy and let them take it away.
Thanks so much, Brad. Okay, so quick introduction to who we are. So this is the JV staff. Almost all of us are pictured here. I have another slide that shows Franco, who is our Pathways intern, who's not pictured in this particular photo here, but we have 7 staff members. I am the coordinator of the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture. I'm based out of Western Massachusetts in the Northeast Fish and Wildlife Services Regional Office in the Migratory Bird Program. We also have a South Atlantic coordinator, Craig Fallhaber, right here. North Atlantic coordinator, Mitch Hartley. We have a science coordinator, Mo Carell. Our spatial analyst, Kirsten Luke. She's not on the call today. She's over here on the left. Deb Reynolds is our communications coordinator. And then Franco here with a goose is our pathways intern focusing on our updating and refining our database of projects and among other things. So that's the staff. And I did want to make one announcement here. I'm going to turn this over to Mitch because Mitch recently, I think most of you know Mitch, recently accepted another position within migratory birds. So he will unfortunately be leaving the joint venture, much to our sadness. But Mitch, do you want to go ahead and tell folks what you'll be up to?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. I'm going to be working as chief of the Division of Bird Habitat Conservation and Headquarters, replacing Carrie Duncan in that position. So that office includes the NACA program, the Neotrop Migratory Bird Act program, and the duck stamp office.
All up on the Eastern Seaboard. Help up on that.
Sorry.
And then finally do yoga.
I think someone needs to mute.
Oh.
Okay, there we go.
I'm sorry. Yeah, did you hear that, Amy?
Yep.
Okay.
Was that the end? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, so Mitch will continue to have his Fish and Wildlife Service email address, so you all know where to find him, and I know he'll always be available for questions, even if it's not related to his next job duties.
And Amy, I think someone raised their hand. I'm not sure. I don't know if that was a question or maybe it's in the chat. Sorry.
Okay. All right, so just briefly, a little bit about how the joint venture is structured. So you just heard from Brad. Brad is our management board chair. Every joint venture is governed by a management board of partners that represent state, federal, and NGO interests in bird conservation. And so the management board kind of determines the focus and the vision of the joint venture. And then each management board member has representative on the technical side that serves as kind of providing the technical expertise and guidance to the joint venture on the priorities that the management board has set. And then for our joint venture, the technical committee is then kind of expanded into these 3 different working groups. And this is a highly simplified schematic of the way that our working groups work, but we do have 3 flagship species-based working groups, and really, these working groups can represent just about anybody who has the relevant expertise. They can include people who are on the technical committee as well as people who are beyond, like it can include other academics, other NGOs, a variety of different people at the state level. Basically, anyone who has something to bring to the that working group on those species is allowed to be on the working group. And then we have, like, this breaks down even further in that we have state level working groups and kind of subsets of working groups formed to solve particular challenges or needs. So this is just a very kind of like high level schematic of how the joint venture structure kind of functions. And the agencies that are the groups that are represented on the joint venture include all of the wildlife agencies across the states from Maine to Florida. We also have Fish and Wildlife Service representatives from the Northeast and the Southeast, USGS representatives from the North and the South, NRCS also, and Park Service. We have academic institutions that are very engaged in our work, including the Saltmarsh Habitat and Avian Research Program, the USGS co-op units, and other academics. And then the big NGOs that are involved in bird conservation, like Ducks Unlimited, American Bird Conservancy, Audubon, and the Nature Conservancy. Those entities all serve on our management board. And the joint venture, we kind of see ourselves, I guess, as service providers, and we try to learn from the wider partnership what the needs are, what gaps need to be filled, kind of on this larger regional level, on projects that need larger regional coordination that couldn't happen just at kind of the levels where people are already working, where they need some kind of scaling up support. And so we do a whole variety of different things, and that includes ghostwriting and grant coordination. We do a lot of this, matchmaking of projects on the ground with funding opportunities, rolling things up and scaling them up to make them more competitive, and providing those services in whatever way partners would like them. And sometimes that's like, I just need someone to edit this proposals. Sometimes it's like, can you just be the person who puts the meetings on the calendar and make sure we stay organized and moving forward? And sometimes it's, can you write a big chunk of this proposal? And we're happy to do any of that. We also provide, through the services of Craig and Mitch, a lot of support for the NACA and coastal grant programs, which provide a tremendous amount of funding for high priority projects along the Atlantic coast. We do a lot of partner coordination on whatever it is that the project need is. Oftentimes that's kind of the big capacity gap where people realize something needs to be done and they want to do that thing or see that thing done, but they don't have the capacity to kind of like take on the administrative burden of doing all the coordination and bringing people together and sending out calendar invites and all those things that take time. We also provide a tremendous amount of science support, as you can see from these little screenshots of the various tools and products we've developed over the years. These two on the left are our salt marsh sparrow priority areas and marsh migration priorities. This middle one is our black rail priorities. The next one to the right is our black duck decision support tool. And then this far right image is just one of the priority marshes that has been mapped for ditches, and all of the marshes across the Northeast have been fully mapped for their ditch infrastructure. And then we're just kind of, we view ourselves as dot connectors. If there's a gap that needs to be filled, if there's a need or a challenge that's been really sticky and thorny, we try to provide whatever support is requested of us by our partners to connect those dots. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to Mitch to provide, wait, no, I'm not. There's a couple more slides before the NACA stuff. So for salt marsh conservation funding, just as one example of kind of the grant matchmaking coordination support that we provide, we do a lot of tracking of the projects across the partnership, not just the ones that the JV is involved in, but we try to track as many of the grants that have been applied for and secured across the joint venture partnership. And so these are very conservative numbers. We obviously aren't tracking everything because we only know what we know and we don't know what we don't know. But in 2024 alone, we know of at least 13 projects that total more than $48 million of new grant funding that's been tracked across the joint venture. And the ACJV helped to facilitate about $7.8 million of these grants, so about 16%. And that's through those services that I just described, ghostwriting and partner coordination and such. And some of these are also internal funds where we're internally advocating for funds to be applied to the priority projects that you all have told us are important. And there's another $8 million of additional ACJV facilitated grants that are still pending. And so, as you can see from this figure here, 2024 was really a banner year with all of the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act resiliency funding that was out there. It was a really big year for getting salt marsh projects funded. Definitely very exciting. And so you can see just like how much money was brought in over that time. And there's still some kind of out there waiting to be determined. As another example of partner coordination and ACJV facilitation, we do have 2 National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grants that we played a role in. Mo's going to talk more about this Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund project a little bit later, so I'm not going to go into any detail on that. But we also partnered with the Friends of Herring River and a bunch of other partners out on Cape Cod in Massachusetts to develop a proposal that was ultimately successful for about $6 million of restoration projects throughout the Cape. And that was one of those proposals that sort of started with some partners saying, yeah, I want to apply for this, but I don't have a project big enough to meet the cap for the funding. And then finding other partners in that landscape that we could kind of bundle it all together and tie there were 3 different sets of projects, tie all 3 projects together using the ACJV priority marshes as kind of the thread that links them all together. And then another big initiative was this Department of the Interior Keystone Initiative that is a little bit lesser known. Some of you who are involved in these conversations are probably familiar with it, but otherwise it was kind of just a few years of funding that was available to the Department of the Interior. In 2023, we were able to get about $1.5 million for some projects in Maryland and Virginia. And then in 2024, we put in another proposal for another 1.3 million for dredge placement and design projects in 3 different states. Unfortunately, these are all pending the passage of an FY25 budget, and they are bill funded, and so it's uncertain whether they're going to continue to, whether they'll actually receive the funding or if they're going to be pulled out of the budget. And the same for the 2024 proposal. We put in a really big ask in 2024 for $5.2 million that would have supported 10 new positions across the Atlantic coast, and they would include things like someone to do engineering designs on all national wildlife refuges that need it, and oversight of projects and project management of projects on like larger state scales or regional scales. And it was a pretty cool package. And it also included 3 implementation projects in Florida and New Jersey. And I'm totally blanking on the third one right now. But it was a great passage. Unfortunately, the rules on the funding of that is that this funding would not be available until the passage of an FY26 budget. And again, these are bipartisan infrastructure law funds. And so I'm not thinking it looks good that this package is going to get funded, but I'm putting it out there to let you all know that that went in and it's still out there, and we'll know, I guess, in a year or so whether the projects are going to get funded. All right, now I'm going to pass it over to Mitch to cover our NACA and coastal grant accomplishments.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to talk mostly about 2 grants that are joint venture wide. The first one is the North American Wetland Conservation Act, or NACA. And Craig and I spend a pretty big chunk of our time working with partners on NACA grants. And as the slide implies, we kind of work on all sides of this. We work with partners to develop their proposals, and we will take a look and edit some of their proposals and offer comments. The joint venture management board has a ranking committee, so we actually submit ranks to headquarters as to which projects we think are most important in our joint venture. We work with NACA council staff to make sure that they understand our proposals if they have questions, or work with the applicants to resolve or clarify issues that come up during the review. When the grants are awarded, we work on clearances for those grants with headquarters. And then when they're in administration, we work with partners and headquarters on things like track substitutions. We kind of provide like some in-field support to headquarters and a little bit of QA/QC on some of that sort of thing. Next slide. A little bit, for those of you who aren't familiar with NACA, it's changed a little bit in the last couple of years. So the standard grant now, which is the big one, that's a maximum of $3 million grants. And you need at least a 1-to-1 match for that. But a lot of times the match is land value and other contributions of work that partners have done in the last couple of years, or is kind of in the hopper for the next couple of years. So it's not like partners are necessarily bringing cash to those projects. Those are awarded twice per year. The application window is open twice a year, in February and July. And I'll just say, in this year is a little bit different. In the past, February was the first round of the fiscal year, and July was the second round of the fiscal year. But there was often a time lag. We can't actually award grants until we have a federal budget. And as many of you know, in the average year, we don't have a federal budget like this year until we're somewhere like 6 months into the federal fiscal year, and sometimes even later, like 10 or 12 months into the fiscal year, we get the final budget through a series of continuing resolutions and so on. So what council decided to do just this year is pause this February cycle. We're not accepting proposals this February. We're going to start in July, but then after that, we will go back to the February and July cycle, but July will be the first round of the fiscal year, and February will be the second round. And what that'll mean is that when you apply for the July grant and you find out that you've gotten funding, the federal budget will be in place by then. And the same thing with February. And it should get rid of that lag where our applicants have got grant awards, but we're waiting for the federal budget for them to actually get the money. So no February proposals being accepted this year, but then it'll go back to the kind of normal February and July thing. And if anyone has questions about that, feel free to reach Craig and I after. Small grant program has changed slightly. The maximum grant now is $250,000. That's still one round per year, typically in late October, early November. Next slide. It's been a great year for our partners with NACA grants. We had all 6 of our proposals in the first round and five out of 8 in the second round be awarded this last year, this calendar year. So that's $29 million in grants, which was matched by over $59 million of partner contributions. And collectively, that's going to protect or restore or enhance 91,000 acres between Maine and Florida, which is, we average something like 50,000 or 60,000 acres a year. So it was definitely an above average year, which is great. Next slide. I'm shifting gears now to another Fish and Wildlife Service grant program, the National Coastal Wetland Conservation Grant Program, which is administered jointly by the Office of Conservation Investment in our coastal program. And in the Northeast region, I work with those programs and sit on the national team. And Craig provides support to partners in the Southeast as needed. And that program has been around for a long time, about the same amount of time as NACA. The maximum award is $1 million, but it only requires like a 25% match, which can also be in kind. So it's a little bit lower match threshold. As has been the case in the last, I think, 5 years at least, all 10 of the proposals from the ACJV were funded. Almost 100% of the proposals received nationwide have been funded for the last 3 or 4 years. So this is has not been lately the most competitive of federal competitive grant programs, and we highly encourage all the states to apply. The state agency has to be the applicant, but they can pass those funds through to any partner, and a lot of states do. So this year that meant 10 million in grants, over 15.5 million in match, and it's collectively conserving 3,800 acres in the coastal zone of Maine, Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And the last thing I'll say about this is that we've really been trying to beat the bushes and encourage states to apply because, as I said, this is almost guaranteed money for most projects. And I was really pleased to see a response with several proposals coming in from the Northeast, which has kind of been lagging the Southeast in recent years. So great job kind of all around joint venture wide or putting in these coastal grants. And again, if anyone wants to know more about these grants, please reach out to Craig and I at any time. The last thing I'll just say before we switch to this slide, that's okay. We also have a GLRI grant, which just affects the Lower Great Lakes St. Lawrence Plain in our joint venture. It's a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding that goes through EPA to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we co-administer a grant with the Upper Great Lakes. So we awarded a couple projects in upstate New York in the St. Lawrence Valley this year to partners. But that only affects one state generally, 1 or 2 states, Western Pennsylvania or New York. So I won't say more about that, but anyone from those states can reach out about that as well. And that's it for me.
All right, so then moving into the coordination and information sharing portion of the accomplishments, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mo.
Okay, great, thank you. So, as many of you know, in 2021, we started pulling together guidance or recommendations for where restoration work could happen within each state in the breeding range of the salt marsh sparrow to help support the species. And that started kind of like a round of version 1.0 documents and then version 2.0 documents to update all of that information with information that we know is out there about what projects are on the ground in our priority areas, who is doing those that important work, and who is in need of further support to continue doing that into the future. We also have an idea of what restoration techniques may be appropriate at each one of those sites, and a map of each one of those priority areas, again from Maine all the way down to Virginia. So I just wanted to report to you all that this year they are all done, and you can follow that fun little QR code with the dinosaur in the lower left-hand corner of your screen if you'd like to see them all kind of stitched together in map fashion. But next slide, please. You can see the static documents also on our website. And if you click down into one of the priority marshes on the salt marsh mapper, you can get to one of these documents. It links right to the documents and the attribute tables there, or you can navigate to them on our website. I love showing the slides so much. Shout out to Deb Reynolds, who's our communication coordinator, who made these a lot easier to read because they are so pretty. So again, please go ahead and take a look at those resources on our website. And also know that you can access them in spatial format through our Saltmarsh Sparrow Mapper. Next slide. One thing we did in 2024 that was specific to Maine, but part of a larger expansion that I'll talk about a little bit more later, is we added additional Maine priority areas to extend from the formal range boundary for the Saltmarsh Sparrow to include the rest of Maine. So for those of you who are Maine nerds out there like myself, Saltmarsh Sparrow Range stops right in Rockland, Maine, but they have, there's been detections of breeding activity and certainly Saltmarsh Sparrow genes being detected further along down the coast, and their sister sparrow, the Nelson sparrow, exists throughout the coastline of Maine in tidal marshes. And so what we did was in response to a request from the state, we expanded our priority areas to include those marshes along the rest of the coastline in mid-coast and down east Maine. So we're calling it version 2.1. You can follow the QR code here to go directly to the static document for Maine. But we followed the exact same methods and protocol as we did for the rest of the breeding range to identify those sites. And we added a few new partners, which you can see listed below. Next slide, please. And here are our new priority areas. Because Maine has so many marshes now, I think Maine and New York are kind of in the running for most priority marshes for a single state. We split them down into 3 different sections. And this actually created some debate within our Maine partners is how to exactly split these up. But this is how they're sectioned out within the document. Yeah. Okay, next slide. And I will hand it back to Craig for this.
Hey everybody, so similar to our efforts for Saltmarsh Sparrow that Mo just talked about, we've been working on a state guidance document for black rails in Florida to identify priority sites and those near-term site-specific actions so that when funding opportunities come available, we can link those up with some of the management actions that we've identified. Next slide, please. So in 2024, because Florida is so big, we divided it up into 4 regions, kind of like Maine divided theirs into 3. And so we had a Gulf Coast, Central Florida, South Florida, and an Upper St. Johns River Basin and Merritt Island region. And so we had a series of workshops with partners in 2024. And through that process, we identified 33 priority areas and 45 areas that we're calling areas for future exploration. In other words, places that we don't know a lot about black rails or their habitat, but we want to learn more. And I'm going to talk a little bit more when we get to our 2025 plans about the future plans for that document. But first, I want to tell you about another way in which we provide coordination for partners, and that's through state-level working groups. Next slide, please. So first off, we provide facilitation and coordination support for a group called South Carolina Black Rails, which formed in February of 2024. That group is led by the South Carolina Division of Natural Resources and the Moore's Wildlife Foundation. They've had 4 meetings so far that we've helped to organize and facilitate, and they've been focusing on impoundment management and creating new non-tidal habitat for black rails. So really excited to see what that group accomplishes in the future. Next slide. We also helped to organize and facilitate a meeting of the North Carolina Black Rail Working Group that occurred in November of 2024. That group is led by the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, so thanks to our partners there. We had 24 participants from 7 organizations. That group plans to meet annually with the goal of providing a venue or a forum for information exchange, for networking, to create partnerships, to increase the efficiency of our conservation actions, and to share data with one another. Next slide. All right, I'm going to hand it back over to Mo.
Yeah, one other thing we ended up doing in 2024 was producing the front-facing document that you see pictured here. It's called Coastal Marsh Restoration and Ecosystem Approach for the Mid-Atlantic. And this is really a product of conversations that had been going on again since roughly 2021 between NOAA, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the ACJV staff and partners. Really trying to give some a bit of a zoom out to emphasize the importance of thinking across the entire ecosystem when developing restoration plans and permit applications to enact those plans, as well as all sorts of other stuff that you can find in this document. You can see the QR code shown there. We kind of, this is a longer document, and so we boiled it down into some highlights in a webinar that you can also watch. It's on our ACJV YouTube channel. So please take a look there. There was a fair amount of interest in next steps. We haven't completely identified what that holds right now, but certainly if you have any questions about the contents of this document or learning how to take next steps and be part of the conversation moving forward, I would love to hear from you. So please reach out to me directly. And let's see, what do we have after that? I think we go into 2024 accomplishments for science support, which is also me. So I'll just keep right on going. Let's see, in 2024, we took a look at some data that were collected in late 2023 or maybe early 2024. I think it was January 2024, where we were able to fly a LiDAR unit over some of our marshes, our partners' marshes in South Carolina, to measure hydrology and microtopography using UAS or uncrewed aircraft systems. Of course, the flights are now complete, and the LiDAR was successful in predicting both vegetation and ground elevations, even through some of that really thick vegetation that you find in some of our southern tidal marshes. So that was a really kind of wonderful thing for us to find out. And we are in the process of, well, we're actually waiting back to hear on a proposal to fly very similar flights at a variety of marshes to understand black rail habitat characteristics and habitat use. From New Jersey all the way down to Florida. So we should be hearing back about that in the next couple of months. But again, happy to answer questions about this work before then. I think there's a lot of promise moving into the future to understanding black rail habitat use a little bit more. Next slide. This is another very exciting product that came out in 2024. We worked with two postdocs through the University of Massachusetts and the USGS. We called ourselves the NERDS, the Northeast Restoration Decision Support Group. And these two postdocs really took it upon themselves to understand the relationship between ditching in the Northeast, or visible ditches in northeastern tidal marshes, and the different characteristics that we might, some of the physical characteristics that we might find through remotely sensed data on those sites. In order to do that, they took it upon themselves to digitize every single visible ditch that they saw from Maine all the way down to Virginia. And that is quite a feat. So I'm happy to say that this layer is now available for public use. You can use the QR code, or Deb is doing a great job in posting those links in the chat as well. But please use this layer. There's a lot of metadata when you click on that link to download the layer. So a lot of how it was made and how it was QA/QC'd can be found there. They are also in the end stages, the two postdocs, in pushing their research, or how this ditching layer is related to different physical aspects of the marsh. Is in the middle of peer review, so we should be hearing more from them fairly soon. But thank you very much to Aaron and Julie, who digitized all of those ditches. Next slide. Another thing that came out in early 2024 was this document, Recommendations for Monitoring Salt Marsh Sparrows on Salt Marsh Restoration Projects. So this was developed jointly with Ducks Unlimited, the Salt Marsh Habitat and Avian Research Program, and the Fish and Wildlife Service to create kind of coordinated guidance for monitoring salt marsh sparrows at restoration sites. If you're interested in understanding how the restoration that you were planning to do or just did potentially impacted the sparrow populations there, this gives an idea of how to go about that process, how much it might cost, important context for learning more, and important decisions that you need to make before you actually start monitoring your sites. And you can see our decision tree that we developed on the left-hand side of this slide. This is, in my opinion, probably the most important part of the document, is kind of suggesting, okay, we don't know anything about salt marsh sparrows or tidal marsh sparrows at our location. What do we do next? It kind of walks you through how to collect more information about the salt marsh sparrows at your local sites. So this is available on our website. Follow the QR code or the link. And again, let me know if you have questions. Next slide. Also available on our website is our American Black Duck Decision Support Tool. This was really brought across the finish line by our partners at Ducks Unlimited, or DU. And this affords kind of a few different ways to understand prioritization for American black ducks within the geography of the ACJV. It also was recently funded to get an update to be crosswalked with some of the wetland information that we have in Canada. So a update to this tool is in the future. All right, next slide. Okay, back to Craig. Craig, you're muted.
Thank you. Tricky headset. So another way that we're providing science support is through user error, like I just had. No, so it's through our adaptive resource management project. This project is a partnership with the USGS and East Carolina University. And we're engaging with partners through this on a multi-year collaborative project to create this adaptive management framework that's going to help us address a couple of different approaches to habitat management for black rails. The first of these approaches involves looking at the effects of fire and herbicide on reducing woody vegetation and increasing occupancy for black rails. And the second looks at the effects of supplemental irrigation on trying to improve black rail occupancy. Next slide, please. So in 2024, I'm happy to report we finalized protocols and data sheets for black rail surveys, vegetation surveys, and also monitoring for hydrology for this effort. Just as one example of a partner that is contributing data to this effort, the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources has a project shown here on the right. They're looking at the effects of supplemental irrigation on improving habitat for black rails in South Carolina and are going to be contributing data that's going to feed into this effort. So if you're interested in partnering and being involved, you can reach out to either me or Mo. Next slide. All right, so for what's in store with in 2025, I'm going to kick it back to Mo.
Get excited, everyone. Our new project database is up and running. I know everyone gets excited about project databases on a Friday, but I will say this is a pretty exciting slide to present. This is the first time we're showing it. But we now have a front-facing, newly updated restoration project database on our website. You can follow the QR code, and I'm sure Deb will also put it in the chat. But this database is meant to kind of catalog any coastal marsh restoration project from Maine all the way down to Florida. And the reason that we are maintaining this is because we've found an increased need to kind of, host this information, both in finding ways to support work going forward on the ground, connect opportunities, funding opportunities with partners actually doing work on the ground, and also to understand how work that's happening at different scales is summing up across states or across regions. So we encourage you to go take a look. We have an overview page that is what the screenshot is here. There's also a way to add one of your own projects, update a project that already exists, explore the projects. If you want to get nerdy and use some filters, you would use the Explore the Projects button. And then also, if you are one of our partners that has a lot of projects that you're managing on the ground, there's a way to do bulk upload so you don't have to add every single project over and over through the Survey 123 interface. Next slide. If all of this sounds like a lot of information, I don't blame you. It's a lot of information for me too. We plan to host a Coastal Marsh Project Database webinar on Friday, February 28th, 2025. It'll be from 11 to 12 a.m. Eastern Time. And we plan to send that out to all of the existing project partners that we have in the database, as well as our ACJV list. If you want to make sure to be included on that webinar, feel free to reach out to me directly and we'll make sure that you get the invite. But this webinar will basically go over, the new front-facing database, how to use it, explore the updated project and bulk upload sections, which are new. And then it should, we plan to give a hefty amount of time for question and answers to get your answers solved or get your answers as soon as possible. One other resource that we have, you're good. One other resource that we have is our Pathway student, Franco Gelotti, who joined our staff this year. He is going to be kind of our go-to as far as helping getting our partners information in the database. There he is. Hello, Franco. He doesn't always carry a goose with him. So reach out to him directly, reach out to me, reach out to Kirsten, our spatial analyst, and we'll get your questions answered. But in the meantime, just hang tight because we will have an informational webinar coming in a little less than a month from now. Okay, next slide. All right, this one is for Mitch.
All righty. Yeah, so I just wanted to let people know that we have we're sort of reconvening the Black Duck Working Group and expanding it to include some of the habitat delivery folks that we really weren't connecting with through our traditional Black Duck committees. Like our sort of formal Black Duck Tech Committee was largely made up of Joint Venture Management Board reps that sit on the Atlantic Flyway Council, like basically the state waterfowl biologists and the DU staff and some USGS folks and so on. And what we heard from them is that like a lot of the people doing on the ground delivery for black ducks aren't in those meetings. So we're having kind of a Black Duck Working Group, a revamped Black Duck Working Group meeting coming up this April. We're going to kind of review the progress we made on the Black Duck Conservation Plan and where we need to go in terms of what the priorities are in the different states and identifying, future priorities and opportunities of working more closely together. Next slide. Oh, sorry. The other thing I wanted to talk about, I forgot we didn't have a slide in there, is just Chesapeake Bay, a kind of an update. We've had a lot of focus on Chesapeake Bay and New Jersey with black ducks, really going back quite a few years now. We had some Chesapeake Bay program money to hire a private lands biologist to do farm bill delivery back in 2017 for a couple of years. And that partnership that was coordinating that, which was kind of co-led by the Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited and Fish and Wildlife Service staff, that group has continued to work closely together. We had a summit this last year with natural resources state cons and state leadership from several Chesapeake Bay states, the Delmarva states and Pennsylvania. We're trying to take better advantage of NRCS's Black Duck initiative under the Working Lands for Wildlife, which is established, I think, back in 2016 or so, which includes the Delmarva states plus New Jersey. And that group is kind of continuing to work, although much of the actual progress that's happening, I feel like, is being done through Sarah Fleming and DU staff. And they've worked, they've got a variety of outside funding from NIFWIF and others to hire several private lands biologists working in the whole Delmarva region, primarily focused on Farm Bill implementation and NRCS programs. So there's still a lot going on down there, mostly under DU's leadership currently. But everything that was happening is kind of still underway and kind of moving forward. I think now we can move to the next slide.
All right, so wanted to give you an update on kind of where we're going in 2025 with our state guidance documents. So first off, the Florida Black Rail document I mentioned earlier, we've got a draft out to our land managers and other partners for them to review and make sure I captured all their information correctly during our workshops. And then we're really excited to be coming out with a final draft of that document later in 2025. And I'm sure that Deb is going to do a great job of making it really easy to look at, as well as hopefully containing a lot of great information for our partners. Next slide. And so up next, we're hoping in the future to start doing a state guidance document for black rails in North Carolina, as well as a salt marsh sparrow wintering range series of documents. And I'm going to let Mo talk about those.
Awesome, thanks. Next slide. Yay, salt marsh sparrow prioritization in the wintering range. So we've had a lot of preliminary success with using our priority areas within the breeding range for the salt marsh sparrow to direct restoration work at different scales. And so the plan is to now expand across the wintering range with a different set of priority areas, looking at a slightly different set of habitat characteristics and needs. to help support those sparrows throughout their full annual cycle. So you can see kind of our plan of attack on the left-hand side. In early 2025, we're convening wintering range experts to decide on the approach for the initial marsh ranking. This is similar to what we did in the breeding range. We did a larger landscape level analysis to identify potential marshes that could be priorities, and then really reviewed them with an expert group specific to each state. And so the very beginning of the process for deciding how to do that first the first round of identification is happening on February 5th. And so I look forward to starting that process. It should be interesting. I'm excited to learn a lot more about the wintering needs for salt marsh sparrows, because we focus often so much on the breeding season in the range. In spring, we plan to move forward with the landscape level analysis, and then over the next year and a half, document the content and develop, a front-facing set of priority areas with state working groups. And so we're hoping to finish that by the end of fiscal year 26. Yeah, all right. Next slide. One thing to think about, and one thing that we are considering, is do we prioritize marshes for wintering mixed species flocks instead of just salt marsh sparrows? I think there could be a lot of benefit to that, but we're not totally sure the way forward. As many of you probably know, salt marsh sparrows, Nelson sparrows, seaside sparrows, and hybrids all kind of, coexist on the wintering grounds. They use high marsh roosts very similarly. It's often very hard to tell them apart. If you see a little brown butt flying away from you and they're not singing, it's really hard to know what species that is. So that is something that we might be considering in the next couple of months. All right, next slide. I'll hand it back to Craig.
Okay, so another way that we're hoping to provide some science support for partners coming up in 2025 is through our Black Rail ARU project. So essentially, right now, our call playback surveys for black rails could be pretty labor intensive because black rails are so cryptic and so difficult to detect. And so to help overcome those hurdles, those sort of logistical difficulties, autonomous recording units are potentially a really intriguing option. Right now, however, for those autonomous recording units or ARUs, the recognizer models aren't as good yet for black rails as they are for other species, especially in some parts of the Atlantic coast. And so the post-processing becomes really time-consuming. So we've got kind of a backlog of ARU data that's built up. And what we're hoping to do is to get a pathway student on board who can help partners work through that backlog and also try and improve those recognizer models so we can decrease future post-processing time for our partners. So we're awaiting a decision on whether we'll be able to bring on that pathway student, and so we'll keep you updated. If we are able to bring that student on, that person will be able to work across the Atlantic coast. So we're really excited to be able to help our partners through that. Next slide, please. Another way that we're working with partners right now is through NRCS's Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP. If you haven't heard about this before, it's a way to kind of mix and match a bunch of different existing efforts that NRCS has. So for example, you can do land management practices that are similar to EQIP or the Conservation Stewardship Program, but you can mix those with things like rentals that are similar to the Conservation Reserve Program, or easements that are similar to NRCS's other easement programs, even watershed projects. Next slide. So what we've been doing is working with partners in the Georgia and South Carolina Sentinel landscapes to submit a proposal for RCPP. We submitted it in 2024, but didn't get the funding, so we're resubmitting in 2025. Next slide. So our lead partner for this effort is the Georgia Conservancy, and we're also working with the Georgia-Alabama Land Trust, TNC in Georgia, the Open Land Trust, and the Department of Defense. It's in coordination with the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative, or SASMI. And our goal here is to really help facilitate marsh migration in these coastal areas. Next slide. So if you've got any good ideas for future RCPP projects that would fit well with the joint venture's priorities, definitely feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to chat about those. Next slide. All right, back to Mo.
All right. So you might recognize the document in the lower left-hand corner from earlier on in the presentation. We cranked that out in 2024, and thankfully it's being used, and we need to update it. So the plan for 2025 is to combine this document with the rapid assessment protocol that it references kind of extensively within the document. The rapid assessment protocol is for use on, restoration sites or other sites that you want to be quickly evaluating for demographic information about tidal marsh sparrows. And it was developed by the Salt Marsh Habitat and Avian Research Program, or SHARP. So the plan for early 2025 is to kind of combine these documents together, make the rapid assessment protocol a little bit more streamlined with everything, all of the information in one place, and then append that to the recommendations for monitoring salt marsh sparrows on restoration project sites document. And that way it'll be kind of like a one-stop shop for how do we get started, what do we do to assess tidal marsh sparrow populations on restoration sites. So stay tuned for that. Next slide. Rapid assessment is basically a combination of a point count, some fixed effort misnetting, and some other behavioral documentation and modification, as well as vegetation surveys. No modification, just documentation of breeding behavior of other tidal marsh birds that happens, at an individual site twice a season within the breeding range for the species you're trying to measure. We have a lot of rapid assessment planned for 2025, but as I'm sure almost everyone on the call is aware, we've had a lot of kind of funding ups and downs at the federal government level. And so we are hoping that this can still happen, but we are unsure if the money will be able to be moved in time. So stay tuned for that. But you can see that our partners are kind of keyed up, ready to go. And at least a subset of the rapid assessment will happen. But we don't know if the full plan will take place. We'll just have to report back in a year. Next slide. One other thing that we recently received support from the Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund to do was to kind of start asking some research questions about this rapid assessment data that we've been collecting. So these two questions are what we're hoping to answer in the next couple of years, using support from NIFWF as well as leveraged funds from partners. One, how does hydrological restoration in salt marshes impact tidal marsh sparrows? That will be tackled by one of the Sharp University's SUNY ESF through a new PhD student there. Also, how do tidal marsh birds utilize peat placement sites from runneling? This is something that's really kind of come up as an important topic in the last couple of years as more and more partners and more restoration practitioners are considering runneling on sites that are occupied by salt marsh sparrows. And so we're interested in understanding, how are they using these peat placement areas that is that's produced during the runneling process, because runneling is really a small ditch or channel that's created to relieve standing water in areas. So how do we use that peat well? How do we place it well? And certainly, how do we place it in such a way that is not detrimental to the salt marsh sparrow populations or tidal marsh sparrow populations in those areas while we wait for the restoration to kind of take hold and fully progress. So that question will be answered, will be asked by a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire, also through the SHARP program. Next. Okay. In the meantime, as we all know, sometimes it takes a couple years to ask a research question and get an answer. And so in the meantime, what do we do with this runneling peat that we're kind of that is being produced through these different restoration efforts? We are happy to, and we plan to, in the first part of 2025, put up some basic guardrails and suggestions, recommendations for how to use runneling peat to at least not negatively impact salt marsh sparrow populations, because so much runneling is happening in some of those areas where salt marsh sparrows already occur and are occupied by that species. So we plan to work directly with restoration practitioners throughout the breeding range to develop that protocol, in addition to experts within SHARP and elsewhere, to make sure that we fully address species needs when developing this recommendation document. So This is planned for 2025. And if you would like to be part of this conversation, we have not yet scheduled the first meeting, a practitioner expert meeting. And so please reach out if you would like to be involved in that. I think I would like to hear a variety of voices in that conversation too, so we create something that's useful. Next slide. Oh, this is exciting. Okay, so you can see kind of a slider going back and forth on a video of our brand new beta version of Coastal Marsh Change tool, which is not yet ready to be used by the public, but I just kind of wanted to give you a bit of a taste as to what we're planning. This work is also supported by the NIFWIF Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund. And basically you see on the left-hand side of the screen an older classification of tidal marsh vegetation communities: high marsh, low marsh, phragmites, mudflat, upland, and terrestrial border. We developed that, well, Sharp developed that, and I also developed that through my postdoc back in 2016, but that was a long time ago and it's ready for an update. So in order to update that layer, we also were thinking it would be helpful to be able to make it a customizable tool to look at vegetative change across different time steps. So what you see, and Amy, if you can press play on that video one more time, is basically a sliding window. You see the first time step on the left, the second time step on the right, and a pretty easy way to take a look at vegetative change over time in tidal marsh areas. So we'll be working on that hard in the next year or so, and we're hoping to wrap that up by the end of 2025 to make this tool available for others to use. Next slide.
Okay,
All right.
this one's me. So I think this might actually be our last slide. And it doesn't really have a category like the other topics that we've talked about. So this is just a ongoing conversation that we've been having with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Fish and Wildlife Service. We've been having regular meetings for the last couple of years talking about how we can better work together to ensure that more of the dredge sediment is being applied to priority marshes that need additional sediment to enhance elevation. And over the last year or so, we've been jointly working on developing an MOU to further lay out what this collaborative effort should look like. And part of the kind of impetus behind developing this MOU, and they're kind of just coming in backwards, is that the Army Corps has recently established a goal of using 70% of their dredge beneficially by 2030. They call it their 70 by 30 goal. And then of course the ACJV is really interested in using sediment on as many marshes as possible that could use it. And so it created this like perfect opportunity for us to talk about how we might kind of more formally codify a relationship that would help us both achieve our mutual goals. And so just about a month ago, that MOU was signed. So we do have the signed MOU between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Army Corps. It's not just focused on coastal marshes, it's focused on all coastal habitats. So that includes beaches and tidal mudflats and other areas as well, dunes. So it's a pretty expansive MOU. It kind of lays out just like when we'll coordinate, what kind of information we'll share with each other. It ensures that we are talking early in the process so that we have time to identify cost savings and time to identify or time to raise the funds that might be needed beyond the cost that's already like covered through the Army Corps, which is called the federal standard. If you're doing kind of more expensive, more elaborate projects that are further away from the dredge site, there's usually an additional cost that has to be raised by partners. And so this MOU should help us build in more of that time that's necessary to seek those funds to make more of these projects happen. And so the next steps on this is we're currently working on a district by district level in the Northeast. And I should say also that this is a North Atlantic Division MOU. It does not currently affect the South Atlantic. And so that's something that we're also, we've initiated some conversations with Army Corps partners in the South Atlantic. I don't know if that will lead to a similar MOU or not, but it's definitely the initial conversations that everyone's really excited about working together. So in the North Atlantic, we are having these district calls where we're bringing in Fish and Wildlife Service staff and other partners to talk about projects that we have that we anticipate to be needing sediment in the next 5 or so years. and then matching those with dredging opportunities that the Army Corps is undertaking through their normal dredging cycles, and seeing, where there might be some opportunities there to work together. So this is a really exciting development in our partnership with the Army Corps. And that is our last slide. We can now open the floor up for any questions or feedback people have. And if you would like to reach out to any of us, all of our email addresses are here. You can take a screenshot of this if you'd like. And I think most of you already know how to reach us or already have regularly communicate with us. So open it up to anyone who has questions. Mark.
Yeah, Amy, I have a couple of different questions real quick. One, Craig or Mo on the microtopography, with that aerial LiDAR, what was the vertical resolution that you guys were able to get off of that? Is it sub 10 plus or minus 10 centimeters?
Yeah, it was
What was it?
2 to 4, depending on the site, I think.
2 to 4? Okay.
Yeah, it was, yeah. It depended on the location. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And then one other thing, Mo, the research database, we've been talking about a similar sort of thing here for the Gulf Coast, because there's so much restoration that's taken place in the past. And like we drive around and somebody in the boat will go, yeah, that place was reserved, that marsh was restored back in 1995 with side casting, blah, 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 blah. And so in trying to study, the effects of restoration, we've realized that sort of a time for space substitution would be really helpful. So has anybody used the database? I know it's fairly new, but has anybody from a research perspective used it to try to help design and sort of allow for an increased sample size for marsh restoration projects? Do you know? Just curious.
Yeah, so we're actually using it to inform Katie's question at SUNY ESF, taking a look at the hydrologic restoration. And I imagine one way that we will try to take a look at that is through restoration projects that are at different points after the restoration has occurred.
Okay. Yeah, that's exactly the thought we have. Our biggest problem is getting the Corps to allow us access to all their wetland restoration permits. They're just really nervous about us going through all these files, and I'm like, yeah, nothing subversive here. But anyway, okay, thanks. And then real quick, Mitch, this wetlands grant program, I've never even heard of that. So could you, what kind of projects are fundable or can be funded under that program? Because I'll apply for anything that has a pretty good, you know what I mean? I mean,
yeah.
And a lot of my colleagues, I don't think know about it either. So yeah,
the funds can only be used for land protection or restoration or enhancement. So they can't be used for research, monitoring, generally speaking, environmental ed, infrastructure. It really has to be specific to wetland enhancement, restoration, or land protection, including, upland buffers. And they tend to be fairly large projects, like most NACA projects that are funded for standard grants that for $1 to $3 million. The total grant and match acreage is usually well over 1,000 acres. Not all the time, but most of the time. These are usually it's a complex of projects, like either one really large site or several tracks that together make up the project.
Okay.
And again, that's grant and match work, not necessarily just where the grant funds are going.
Yeah, no, that's.
And Mark, the beauty of that is you can gather a bunch of different partners together to kind of cobble together a larger project. So if you have a project, or one of your partners has a project that's smaller than the acreage Mitch was talking about, if you can get partners together, there can be, there frequently are multi-tracked proposals and multi-party proposals, which actually score better with having more partners.
Yeah, there's just several places here that I'm aware of that, people are looking for monies to do things, but they're not on the scale of a NACA grant. And so this is all new to me. So I'm excited. So thank you.
Yeah, just to add one thing to what Craig said, not only should you kind of work with partners, but that the actual purpose of the act was to bring partners together. So some of the scoring specifically says sort of how many partners are working on this, who's putting in money. So not only does the scoring kind of encourage that partnership, it's very sort of built into the program as it by design. And what we've found is that partners who aren't really working together, but I've got my tract over here, you've got yours, when they come together and do a NACA grant, that requires a certain amount of coordination and communication and working together. And as you can imagine, when they get $3 million, they're like, whoa, cool. Like, let's do this again. And what we've seen all over the joint venture is these partnerships become flourishing, like real partnerships that then put in, 10 future grants together as a team. So there's kind of a method to the madness, and it really can do great things. But coastal grants, Mark, are the $1 million coastal grants are not nearly as acreage sensitive. Like, it's not uncommon for national coastal wetland grants to be like 25 or 50 acres for the $1 million. So it's the two programs are really complementary that way.
Yeah, I think some of this smaller grant program, I think, is something that folks here along the Gulf Coast can use to get them started, because there's a lot of private landowners that are a little nervous about partnering with state or government agencies. But I think if you can show them, hey, we can get you some money to do some work on your property that you want to do, and then build. So that's perfect. So thank you.
Yeah,
that's great.
And I'm just going to add one thing to respond to that, because one way that NACA is very different from, say, Farm Bill funding is that the work can be 100% done by NGOs like Ducks Unlimited or Nature Conservancy or anyone else. Anyone can apply for that money, and the money is given out, So there is a notice of federal participation on land that's protected, saying kind of, hey, this land was pledged to this project. So if something happens to it and it gets developed, you kind of owe us our grant money back. So the grantee has some fiscal and legal responsibility to maintain the project, but the actual checks would go out to the NGO partners who would be working with the landowners, and the federal government doesn't have to sort of write those checks to the landowners, which can be convenient for people who maybe don't want to work directly with the government.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to pull one question from the chat, and then I'm going to go to you, Pat. Does the ACJV have the capability to do UAS work on federal lands?
In short, not directly. No. Let's see, who asked that? I would love to talk more about it. There are a lot of hoops to jump through when it comes to flying a UAS generally, and even more on federal land. So it's complicated, but yeah, I'd be curious to know more about the ask.
Okay. Pat.
So Amy, Mo, and Mitch, I just wanted to talk about a couple novel projects we're doing in Massachusetts. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have in Massachusetts this a granting mechanism called Resilient Mass Grants. And so we have been, Mass Wildlife, or Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, has been very much locked into getting projects completed through that mechanism, Mitch. And so, so a couple salt marsh projects that we have going. The first one is a salt marsh adaptation and resiliency team. It's advanced training of nature-based salt marsh restoration techniques that we're using in Great Marsh and along the coast of Massachusetts. And we're focusing on training state agencies and permitting authorities. And I was just wondering if Frank might be a person who would want to participate, or someone else, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's just to develop a consistent, like well-developed way of implementing. Hi, Frank. So the second project is a salt marsh sparrow monitoring feasibility study, and we're doing that with UMass. It's to test thermal and acoustic adapted drones for long-term efficiency monitoring, because in Massachusetts, in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to have at least 5,000 acres of salt marsh restoration completed. And we want to be able to monitor in some kind of efficient way what's happening with salt marsh sparrow as a result of that. The third project is in fiscal year 26. We're going to complete another 3,000 acres of preliminary restoration design, and that will be coast-wide, not just limited to Great Marsh. And then the last one is a thin layer placement pilot project that we're doing with UMass down on the Cape. And if anybody has any questions, just come to me and I can give you more details on those projects. Thanks for letting me tell you.
That's awesome, Pat. It's so exciting to see everything that Massachusetts is doing. I'm curious, how big is the pilot project for the sediment placement in terms of acres?
It's at Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. I don't know if you know that. That it's probably not going to exceed the project entirely is, I think, over 100 acres, and we haven't. We don't know exactly how much of it's going to be the thin layer placement pilot yet.
Awesome. I'm just excited to see thin layer placement happening in Massachusetts.
Me too.
Other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, then we can break a little bit early and return 15 minutes of your day to you all. We really appreciate you all taking some time out of your schedule to attend the webinar. We're ever so grateful always for the partners that we have. I just think that the folks that are working in the salt marsh system are just some of the very best partners that are out there. I'm like so grateful every day that I get to do this work with all of you. I don't think I've ever encountered a more dedicated group of practitioners. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. Bye.